The guards thought it was just another prisoner's demand, another last request whispered into the stale air of the penitentiary. But when the man in chains spoke, his voice carried the kind of gravity that silenced even the most hardened officers. "I want to see my dog before I die." The room stilled. For a moment, the fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder, the air thickening as though even the walls leaned closer to hear. Shackled in orange, tattoos crawling up his arms like memories he could never erase, the condemned man sat with a weary dignity that unsettled everyone in the room. He wasn't begging. He wasn't pleading for his life. He asked with the stillness of a soldier who had long accepted death, but refused to leave without facing the one creature who had never betrayed him. The guards exchanged glances. Some scoffed quietly, others shrugged as if it were a meaningless whim. But one officer, the youngest among them, shifted uncomfortably. Because in the man's eyes, there was something deeper than a criminal's desperation. There was history. There was pain. There was loyalty. And there was a story no one dared to ask about. Years before the cell walls closed around him, before his name became a number in the state's ledger, he had worn a different uniform. Combat boots that carried him across deserts, a rifle that never left his side, camouflage that smelled of dust, sweat, and gunpowder. He had been a soldier. And not just any soldier, he was the kind men followed without hesitation. Not because he barked orders louder, but because he carried himself with quiet certainty. In the dead of night, when fear made lesser men tremble, he moved like stone through shadows. He spoke little, but when he did, it was enough. War carved deep scars into him, some visible, some buried in places no surgeon could ever reach. He carried the weight of fallen brothers, men who laughed with him one day and bled out the next. He carried the haunting screams of villages, the acrid stench of fire, the metallic taste of blood. But amid the chaos, one bond had saved him, a German shepherd named Shadow. Shadow was not just a military dog. He was a lifeline. Together, they had crossed minefields, tracked insurgents, and sniffed out IEDs buried beneath sand that seemed endless. The dog's bark had saved his unit more than once, warning of ambushes in the dark. And on nights when the nightmares clawed at his chest, Shadow's steady breathing was the only thing that anchored him to sanity. War ends for nations. It rarely ends for soldiers. When he returned home, he was not the same. The medals meant little. The parades were a blur. Civilians clapped, thanked him, but none could see the invisible wounds stitched into his soul. Shadow, however, understood. Shadow stayed. But then came the spiral. The country he fought for was not kind in return. Employment doors closed. Bills piled. The weight of sleepless nights and empty bottles dragged him into fights, into bad company, into mistakes that spiraled out of control. Until one night, one decision, sealed his fate. The court never cared about the soldier he once was. They cared only for the man in chains. Now, facing death, he asked not for freedom, not for forgiveness, not for God's mercy. He asked for Shadow. The warden's office became a battlefield of bureaucracy. "It's against protocol," one officer snapped, slamming a file shut. "We've never allowed animals into death row," another muttered. "What if it's a stunt? What if the dog attacks?" The words bounced around like bullets, cold and sharp. But there was one silence in the room. The young officer again, the one who had flinched earlier. He had seen combat too, though in a different war. His own scars itched at the thought of denying a dying man his last connection to humanity. Finally, the warden sighed, his face carved with lines of indifference. "Fine, but make it quick. 1 hour. Then, we proceed." The decision rippled through the prison. Some mocked it, a dog visit, how pathetic. Others ignored it, their indifference a heavier insult than words. Yet, a small undercurrent of curiosity began to spread. Because deep down, everyone knew. When a man facing death asks for a dog, there's more to the story. The prison yard was cleared. 5 officers stood at attention, their presence a silent wall of authority. The man was brought out, chains clinking softly. each step heavy with finality. He lowered himself onto a wooden chair, placed in the center of the room, his hands trembling despite his hardened demeanor. Then came the sound, the faint click of claws against concrete. Shadow entered. The German Shepherd was older now, his muzzle dusted with gray, his frame carrying the weight of years. Yet his eyes sharp, unwavering, lit up the moment they locked onto the man in chains. Time collapsed. The soldier's breath caught in his throat, his vision blurring as his dog padded closer. For a moment, the world, the guards, the prison walls, the looming shadow of death disappeared. There was only the man and his dog. Shadow sat before him, head tilted, ears pricked, as though sensing the unspoken truth. This was goodbye. The man's chains rattled as he bent forward, tears carving silent paths down his weathered face. "You're still here," he whispered, voice cracking, words spilling like confession. Shadow leaned forward, pressing his muzzle into the man's knees, refusing to move. And in that moment, the silence was deafening. The guards shifted uneasily. Some looked away, their stoic masks slipping under the weight of the moment. Others stood rigid, uncomfortable at the sight of a hardened criminal breaking before a dog. One officer sneered, "Pathetic. All this for a mutt." The words sliced through the air. The young officer clenched his jaw, but stayed silent. The condemned man didn't respond. His silence was louder than any defense. He stroked Shadow's fur with trembling hands, memorizing the texture, the warmth, the rise and fall of breath. He knew these seconds were numbered. But then, something unexpected happened. Shadow refused to leave. When the warden gave the signal to end the meeting, the dog resisted. He pressed harder against the man, teeth bared when an officer tried to pull him away. For the first time in years, the German Shepherd, who had once saved soldiers on foreign soil, was defiant again. It was as though Shadow knew that this was more than a visit, knew that the state was preparing to extinguish the only man he had ever served. The guards struggled, tugging at the leash, their frustration growing, but the dog would not move. The young officer finally stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Sir, maybe let him stay. Just for a while longer." The warden hesitated. He was a man of rules, of systems, of cold efficiency. But in the face of the bond before him, his resolve cracked. He gave a curt nod. What none of them expected was what happened next. As the man buried his face into Shadow's fur, a group began to gather outside the barred windows. Other inmates pressed against the glass, their usual jeers silenced. Prison staff paused in the hallways, drawn by something they couldn't explain. Even the chaplain, who had witnessed countless final hours, stood rooted in place. And then it spread. News leaked beyond the prison walls. Reporters swarmed outside. Cameras captured the image of a shackled man, with his loyal dog pressed against him, a picture that spoke more than any court record ever could. The world began to ask questions. Who was this man really? What had he done to earn such devotion from a dog? And why was society so eager to erase a life that clearly meant something? The man finally lifted his head, eyes red but steady. He looked not at the guards, not at the cameras, but into the distance, as though addressing something larger than the room. "They took everything from me, but not him, not loyalty, not love." His voice carried across the silent hall. Then, softer, he added words that would be repeated in headlines, shared across screens, etched into memory. "A man's sins can condemn him, but a dog only remembers your soul." The silence that followed was unbearable, because everyone knew those words weren't about him alone. They were about every soldier abandoned after serving, every man discarded after his usefulness expired, every broken veteran society had turned its back on. Hours later, as the state prepared to proceed with the execution, something extraordinary happened. A letter arrived, a federal injunction. It turned out that the image of the man and Shadow had reached the desk of a retired general who recognized the prisoner's name, a man who once served under him. a man whose life had been saved by the very soldier now scheduled to die. The general mobilized every contact, every string of influence he still held. The execution was halted. The condemned man was no longer just a number in a prison ledger. He was a decorated veteran whose service had been forgotten, buried under mistakes but never erased. The state had no choice. The death sentence was commuted. When the announcement was made, the prison erupted in murmurs. Some guards shook their heads in disbelief. Some inmates cheered behind bars. But the man himself said nothing. He only turned a shadow, resting his forehead against the dogs once more, whispering words only the shepherd would ever hear. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe without the weight of finality crushing his chest. The story spread across the nation, igniting debates about justice, forgiveness, and the treatment of veterans. But beyond all the noise, one truth remained. In a world quick to judge, quick to discard, loyalty is the rarest, purest currency. The man's last wish had not just saved him. It had reminded everyone watching that, even in the darkest corners, love can pierce through steel bars. Because sometimes, the truest measure of a soul is not found in courtrooms or headlines. It is found in the unyielding eyes of a dog who refuses to forget. Some stories linger long after they're told. This was one of them. If this story moved you, share where you're watching from, and let us know in the comments what loyalty means to you. Subscribe for more stories that honor the silent heroes among us, those who remind us that dignity, sacrifice, and love are never wasted.